love to start by talking about some of your neuroscience work and this approach that you developed looking at brain activity and its relation to consciousness, so connectome harmonics. So traditionally, the way that neuroscientists have looked at brain activity has been in terms of just looking at different regions of the brain and different areas lighting up when we do different kinds of tasks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What's the difference between the way that you're looking at brain activity and what was the inspiration behind that?
Yeah, I think being an outsider to neuroscience when I first began, because I transitioned from medical imaging to neuroscience, I don't know, I kind of had this, maybe it was more intuition than like tangible, formalized thought, but this idea of harmonics being everywhere. And I was already passionate about the idea of harmonics in my PhD. I was using them for data representation and so on.
So what are harmonics before you move on from there?
Yeah, definitely. Good question. So harmonics are these patterns. The easiest way to visualize them is if you drop like a stone into a stable lake, like a peaceful, still lake, you would see this wave propagation. So if it's in a confined space, then the waves become like standing waves. So for example, in musical instruments, when we play music, there's the harmonic wave emerging. And what really fascinated me about that is it's very complex shapes, you know, like beautiful patterns. That's the whole cymatics is coming from that idea. But they only, like, they depend on the frequency. So there's nobody dictating where each point is gonna go. So it's all a holistic approach where the frequency is the underlying trigger. So the frequency triggers the pattern. So there's an oscillatory pattern, a harmonic wave, just like in music. And what really fascinated me was when I realized that these are ubiquitous, they are everywhere in nature. You know, I think in cymatics community, they do a great job finding similarities between, let's say, flowers, fruits. I even have seen one that was resembling the double helix of the DNA. So there's really a lot of visual resemblance, but also mathematical as well. And for me, the biggest maybe leap of faith was when I came across the work of James Murray, where he showed mathematically but also experimentally, he cut metal plates in shape of animal skins. And then he captured the vibration modes of those plates, and he showed that they actually resemble different kinds of animal coat patterns like zebras, giraffes, and leopards, and all kinds of different animal coat patterns for different frequencies. So that was the first time where I was realizing, wait a minute, this kind of principle can explain something biological, not only physical.
So there's an interplay between the frequency of the wave, but also the
domain,
anatomy of the space that it's resonating in.
Absolutely. So
Right.
those are the two factors that determine the shape of the harmonic wave. And then what I did when I transitioned to neuroscience was, okay, let's estimate these patterns on the human brain. What would they look like if we take into account the anatomy of the human brain and the human connectome, which is the long-range connectivity? And that's what yielded the connectome harmonics then. But I really didn't expect it to have a life on its own like it did. So the first realization was, oh, okay, we see one of the networks, the default mode network, in one of the harmonic patterns. And that was like, okay, there's something probably real happening here. So I calculated the network, the harmonics, the connectome harmonics, by solving an equation on that anatomy for different frequencies. And for one frequency, across different subjects, we could see this is consistently matching the default mode network. So that was the first study that we published, and that was the first result. It's just a change of perspective. And I mean, the same change of perspective happened in mathematics, like when Fourier said every function can be represented as a combination of sines and cosines. It's exactly the same thing. If we extend that to the human brain, this would be the equivalent of the Fourier series in the human brain. So it's just a change of representation where instead of looking at brain activity with space and time, we can look at it as state and time, and the state is related to frequency. But then when I realized, okay, they are the extension of Fourier, the Fourier basis to the human brain, which means we can take the fMRI data and we can represent it as a combination of them. And that's when we realized that actually we can extract signatures of consciousness and different states of consciousness with this.
So you're taking the pattern and you're extracting the different frequencies that are going into making up that overall complex pattern?
Yes, so at each time point we have a measurement of brain activity and we can take that as an input and then we can decompose that. The analogy I use is like music. So you can hear a piece of music and you can decompose it into its musical notes and now you have a signature. So it's the same thing when we do that for different states of consciousness. We realized, wait a minute, they all have different signatures.
So yeah, can you say a bit more about that? So how is this signature changing with different states of consciousness, and what different states have you looked at?
I think we began with the psychedelic state. We began with LSD, collaborating with Imperial College back then. Robin Carhart Harris was there. And we decomposed the fMRI data in LSD, under the influence of LSD and placebo, and compared the two. And in that comparison, we found that actually the psychedelic state was amplifying high frequencies and suppressing low frequencies. And then we repeated the same, analysis with psilocybin, the psychedelic compound in magic mushrooms, and later on with DMT, also the psychedelic compound in ayahuasca. And they had exactly the same signature, so they all were showing an amplification of high-frequency connectome harmonic activity and a suppression of low-frequency ones. So that was quite a characteristic signature for the psychedelic state. And later on, in another collaboration with Cambridge, we looked at the data with anesthesia and also vegetative state patients. And they had the opposite signature, where low frequencies were amplified and high frequencies were suppressed.
So I guess it's a really good sign that this is really telling you something. You're measuring something that matters about consciousness if you see it correlating with all of these different states. Does it tell us anything about what consciousness is or how it's working?
I think that is the real rabbit hole. So that's quite tricky. But what it does tell us is, if we look at consciousness, so firstly, it doesn't tell us how consciousness, some scientists think, emerges, like how consciousness emerges from brain activity. No, it doesn't say that. Or if you want to challenge that and go the opposite way, consciousness doesn't emerge. So it doesn't say anything causal, but it gives us hints about the nature of its operation, let's say, how it could be. Or it says, if you look at it through this lens, if you look at it through this perspective, then we can think of shifts of states of consciousness as shifts in the frequency of these brain states. And that can open doors to different questions and different experiments, because in the LSD study, for example, we also found that it was broadening the repertoire of these harmonics, the effect of the psychedelics. So it's in a way lifting up the borders, so our state of mind can expand, can perceive more, experience more, and that's probably anybody who has experienced psychedelics would say similar experiences. That confirms the data.
Is it telling us that complexity and organization, the way that the system is organized, is really important for consciousness?
It's tricky. So it doesn't say that consciousness emerges after a certain level of complexity. There's nothing in the framework I developed that actually says, okay, this is how it happens. But I can say we looked at a concept called criticality. And criticality it's this balance between order and chaos, let's say. The way I think of it is, for example, as order, if you think of a group of soldiers marching, everyone is perfectly aligned. There's no divergence from the collective. And chaos, if you think of like 3 to 5 years old dancing or playing in a room, without any interruption, that can turn into chaos quite quickly. And somewhere in between, where let's say a group of dancers are dancing, everyone can express individually what they feel, but they are influenced by one another. So there's a collective going on at the same time. That's where complexity is highest, and this is what we call criticality. And we found evidence that the brain is already operating at criticality. There are lots of studies showing that. But what we found is that it comes closer to criticality under the effect of psychedelics. That's what the analysis we did with the LSD data showed, that it's already at the brink of criticality, really close. But under the effect of psychedelics, it comes even closer to that critical place. And that's maybe why some people experience this, complex thoughts, and inspiration comes, patterns are filed under that state, and so on.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So with criticality, is that, you talk about this balance between order and chaos. So that sort of balance between the two, is that giving you the greatest repertoire, then the greatest potential for different states? And
yes, that's where the complexity happens, where there is the greatest possibility. Because if you go too much one direction, you come too much to order, there's not much capacity for change. Whereas if you go too much to chaos, there's not so much capacity for meaning. So this is the maximum capacity for meaning, in a way, meaningful experience to emerge.
And so you found that this actually went up slightly with the psychedelic state, which is maybe it's not surprising, maybe it is surprising. Why do you think that our normal waking state isn't already at criticality? You'd think maybe we would have evolved to be operating at the sort of the highest potential for complexity.
Definitely. I think it's our lifestyle. I mean, that's my personal view, but I think our lifestyle is pushing us towards order more than flexibility. Or, like we have meetings at certain times. Of course, we need them to operate together, but our lifestyle is so much more imposed order than, allowing yourself to go with your own rhythm. Like how many of us have the luxury, let's say, to just wake up and say, I feel like doing that. My body tells me doing this, or, I think it's more than anything. I think we are evolved to be at criticality, our brains. But I think the lifestyle that we are choosing, or maybe feel like have to choose, is kind of pushing us more towards the order. We don't listen to our cycles, our body, and our intuition, or maybe we feel we are not allowed to, because the collective Western mindset is, about linear time, about clock, about the meeting, about need to do more than want to do.
Wow. Okay. So we're actually suppressing that natural potential for complexity in a way, in the way that we're living
I mean,
normally.
like I said, I'm saying this as my personal perspective, but I would think so. I think that is one of the biggest contributors, and I think the second one would be our disconnect from nature. I did a yoga teacher training in Bali for a month, and we were a lot in nature. It was based on the 4 elements, and we were working with the elements, the fire, air, water, earth, everything. And after a few weeks, I realized, this state is like so open, so flexible. I feel so alive being in that state. And that's when I remember having the thought, maybe we got disconnected from nature, and that is actually pushing us more towards, because that study was published by then, and my mind was going, maybe that's why we are pushing ourselves more towards the order, too much towards order.
Because nature, I suppose, is inherently unpredictable and uncontrollable, whereas normally a 9 to 5, everything is, like you say, it is
Yeah.
very ordered. You don't need to have that
Yeah.
flexibility. Have you looked for these signatures in other kinds of brains, whether that's, I don't know, young children or animals or more traditional societies? Like, do you see higher complexity or closer to criticality in those kinds of situations?
That's a brilliant question. I am really excited to say, I mean, this is a bit preview, but we have a collaboration with Jetro Tuuleri from Finland. He's now looking at baby brains using the same algorithm. And we haven't looked at the criticality. I think that would be a very interesting to do. The first thing we checked was whether we see the same networks, the same harmonics in baby brains and 5-year-old brains. I mean, I don't know if I should reveal the results without checking with Jetro, but it's promising. I can at least say it's promising. And that would be a very interesting thing to check. My theory would be that baby brains would be closer to criticality, baby, or maybe 5-year-old brains as well, where there's more connection in the brain. So we prune our connections as we go along in our lives.
We start off with more complexity and a bigger repertoire, perhaps more unpredictability, and then it kind of gets pruned and honed as we get older.
That would be my theory, but like I said, it's not tested, but it would be something really interesting to look at. I would imagine, because think of it as like the flexibility is increased. So a child's brain, a baby brain is more flexible in the sense of like they are less bound by the reality as we know it. Whereas as we grow older, our beliefs are getting stronger, more, this top-down processing, what we call, that the belief imposes in a way constraints on our perception. That is getting stronger and stronger as we become adults in life. So we get more in touch with reality as we know it. That those constraints are much stronger.
And what about people who meditate? Because often the state of brains in meditators, there are some similarities with psychedelic states. Is that something that you've looked at?
Yes, actually, we did find similar findings. We did look at the brain of long-term meditators in meditation and in resting state, and compared that to naive subjects, meaning that they haven't meditated before. So it was really interesting. So for meditators, when they are resting, their brains is more like, it's more complex, more free. So that meditation practice actually allows more freedom of thought afterwards in the resting state.
So that does look a bit more like the psychedelic state.
Yes, it does. So we did find some similarities between psychedelic state and long-term meditators. We call it, let's say, meditative brain. I think the main distinction was that in meditation, the low frequencies are not as much suppressed as in the psychedelic state. And that's quite interesting because those low frequency harmonics are where we find these default mode network and other functional networks of the human brain. So in a way, it amplifies high frequencies without equally suppressing low frequencies, which means we are still maybe operating and in touch with the reality as we know it, but there's space for more. More is opened in a way.
And what is the significance, do we know, of the high versus low frequencies in terms of our experience? So presumably the high frequencies are changing faster. So is that more to do with being in the moment, and the low frequencies are more of this sort of stability, sense of self, these longer term influences, or does it not work like that?
That's a really interesting perspective. Yeah. So very tangibly, what we know is low frequencies are like these broad low frequency waves passing through the brain, and high frequencies are, like you said, more higher frequency oscillation, but also more localized. So so the low frequencies can be thought of as more stable, and high frequencies are maybe more individualized, let's say. So it's more affected by individual changes, the anatomy of individual brains. What that means in terms of our experience, let me think about it, because it's going to be a speculation, so anything I say. But high frequencies would give finer details. And for example, the type of experiences that people report in ayahuasca ceremonies, like the visions they have this very detailed pattern quality, and you need high frequency activity to be able to create that type of pattern, and usually more high frequency than low frequency activity. But what it means in terms of our experience, I don't know.
Does any of this tell us anything about what kind of a system that you need for consciousness? Like, is all of this limited to brains and neurons, or is it hinting at a kind of organizational structure or certain complexity that you could have in other kinds of systems? So in integrated information theory, for example, that they're talking about certain kinds of connectivity and structures where you could, in theory, have consciousness in other kinds of things, not just brains. Does this tell us anything about that aspect?
We have to make the link, like, what is consciousness associated with? Because like I said in the beginning, this doesn't tell us how consciousness emerges or how it comes about, or, you know, the causality. There's nothing about the causality. But if we associate it with harmonics, if we were to, it's again a speculation or an assumption, let's say, then harmonics are everywhere. Harmonics can emerge in one cell organism. So there is nothing in this way of thinking that says consciousness only comes about after a certain complexity. And so in that way of thinking, then computers can be conscious, but maybe unlikely one-cell organisms. This would be the way of thinking through the connectome harmonics, would maybe say the opposite, if anything, that it is the organism, the livelihood of it has principles that govern nature, and the same principles govern consciousness and it's the change of its state, let's say. So anything we're talking about this side of it, I think, is about speculation. But I would dare to say that for any theory of consciousness, because it's all about based on assumptions and based on some theoretical leaps and so on. So that's why I wanted to stop in my scientific journey. I wanted to stop, okay, we just stay with correlation. What can we know about the principles, how it operates, how it shows itself, rather than making this causal assumption or theory about it.
Right. But in principle, there's a deeper principle that you can look at there that we find in all of nature. It's not just something that you just see in brains and nowhere else.
Absolutely. And I think that was the biggest motivation for me. We think of human as separate from nature, and we think of the brain as kind of separate from nature or anything. And there is this perspective that I kind of was putting forward. We are part of nature. Why should our brains be governed by different principles than nature? How about we look at the principles that we find everywhere in nature and test if they govern the brain as well? And that was my passion, and that's what I tested, and I didn't find any evidence against so far.